The world had never seen anything like this before. The universe had seen countless species rise and fall, civilizations built and crumbled, but no one could have predicted what humanity would bring. It was not their technology, not their weapons, not their sheer numbers that set them apart. No, it was something far more dangerous, something far more unquantifiable. Humanity had an ability that no other species in the universe seemed to possess, the ability to endure. And with that came a terrifying truth. When pushed to the brink, humans could not be controlled. It started on a planet light years away from Earth, on a world that had once seemed uninhabited but had been hiding something for millennia. It was an ancient world, rich with secrets buried beneath its surface. But there was something about it, a pulse, a frequency that had been calling out for centuries, unnoticed, waiting for the right moment to be heard. That moment came when the first of the invaders stepped onto its soil. They had arrived from a far-off galaxy, their ships gliding through the void with an arrogance only the powerful could afford. They had conquered worlds before. They had swept across civilizations like storms, erasing entire species with a swipe of their hand. But they underestimated what they would find on this world. The first scout, the first daring soul to step foot on the planet, never returned. The reports that followed were cryptic, disjointed. They spoke of strange creatures, of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, of overwhelming, unyielding forces that pushed back against their technology. And yet they kept coming. They sent more ships, more soldiers, all expecting an easy victory, only to find the same thing: resistance, relentless and savage. But there was something else that disturbed them, something they hadn't anticipated. The humans. The humans had followed, of course. A small but determined force, driven by an unshakable will to protect what they called home. They had sent their brightest, their bravest, their fiercest. But as soon as they arrived, they realized the stakes were higher than they had imagined. What they had initially thought was a simple military mission had turned into a fight for survival, not just for their species but for everything they held dear. And that's when they encountered the first real challenge. It wasn't the invaders' advanced technology that shocked the humans. It was their indifference. The invaders didn't care who they were fighting. To them, humanity was just another species to be eradicated, another obstacle in their path. They had faced far more dangerous enemies before. They didn't understand what made humanity different, how every loss, every setback only made them fight harder. They didn't understand the desperation behind human eyes, the way they refused to bow, even in the face of overwhelming odds. There were only a handful of humans left now, scattered across the planet, fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and had no qualms about slaughtering anyone who stood in their way. The invaders had underestimated humanity's resilience, and they were starting to feel the consequences. One man, one of the last of the human forces, crouched in the wreckage of a once bustling settlement. His hands shook as he gripped his weapon, the weight of it a small comfort in the chaos around him. The world had changed. What was once a thriving planet of bustling cities and vibrant life was now a war zone. Buildings were crumbling, skies dark with the smoke of fires that never seemed to stop burning. But he wasn't thinking about any of that. He wasn't thinking about the vastness of the universe or the power of the invaders. He was thinking about the people he had lost, the friends, the family, the civilians who had died in the first wave of attacks. He thought about the children who would never grow up, the elderly who had perished in their homes. He thought about the way humanity had always been underestimated by the galaxy, by every race that came across their path. And he thought about how humanity had never, not once, backed down. This was what made humans dangerous. It wasn't their technology, their strength, or their intelligence. It was their heart. It was the way they clung to life even when it seemed impossible. They had lost everything but they refused to be broken. The man's breath was ragged, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could hear the sound of enemy boots crunching on the debris-filled streets. He knew they were coming. They always came. The invaders had their own strategy, a cold, efficient way of taking out the resistance. But they had never been prepared for the unpredictability of humans. They never expected the desperation, the anger, the burning need for survival that would drive humanity to do whatever it took. He thought about the rest of his team, scattered across the city. They had all made a promise: no one would be left behind. The invaders may have thought that they could wipe out humanity, but they had no idea what they were truly up against. The man took a deep breath, his mind racing. The enemy was closing in. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the last hope of humanity fall in this war. He couldn't let the sacrifices of his comrades be in vain. But as he moved to take his first step, a shadow fell across the street. For a brief moment he thought it was one of his own. But no, it was them, More of the invaders, their dark silhouettes creeping through the smoke. He could hear them speaking in their guttural language, their voices harsh and sharp against the eerie silence of the city. They were close. Too close. The man's pulse quickened, but his resolve hardened. He didn't have time to wait for backup, didn't have time for hesitation. He had to act now. And then, just as he raised his weapon, he saw it, a flash of movement in the distance. Something was happening, something he couldn't quite understand. It was like the air itself was shifting, and the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. His first thought was that it was another attack, but then he realized, it wasn't. The ground shook more violently now, and from deep beneath the surface, he heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't the sound of weapons, nor was it the thundering roar of an explosion. It was something else entirely, something primal, ancient. The man's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone on this planet. Not anymore. He had been so focused on the invaders, so focused on surviving the immediate threat, that he had forgotten about the world itself. The planet had been hiding something for a long time, something far older, far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. And now it was waking up. The man dropped to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief as the ground cracked open, a dark, swirling force rising from the depths. He knew in that moment that humanity's greatest challenge was only just beginning. What had been thought to be a simple survival war against an alien force was now a battle for the very soul of the planet. And the invaders? They were just the beginning. As the earth trembled beneath him, the man's thoughts raced. He had been ready to fight, to protect what was left of humanity, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The ground stopped shaking. The distant rumble faded away. But the tension in the air remained. He wasn't alone anymore. But the question was, who else had come to join the fight? The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy. The man's pulse drummed in his ears as he forced himself to stay still, to stay quiet, even as every instinct in his body screamed for him to move. The dark figure before him, unseen but unmistakable, loomed in the distance, and for a moment he could almost feel its presence, a weight pressing against his chest. It was hard to explain the sensation that had crawled over him. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just dread. It was a recognition of something ancient, something that had been buried for so long that even the universe had forgotten it. Whatever this force was, it wasn't a creature or an enemy that could be fought with weapons. No, this was something far older, something more primal. The man swallowed hard, his breath shallow as the dust settled around him. The city was eerily still, and for the first time since he had arrived, he didn't know if that was a good thing or not. He tried to focus, tried to steady his mind, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that the ground beneath him wasn't just shaking from the tremors, it was alive. The planet itself had stirred, and with it, a presence that no one had been prepared for. But there was no time to think about that now. He had to get moving. He had to warn the others. He pushed himself to his feet, the weight of his weapon a stark contrast to the heaviness in his chest. It was then that he heard it, the low hum, the faint vibration beneath his feet. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as he listened, the sound grew louder, closer. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what it was. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was one of the invaders, some new tactic or weapon that they had deployed in response to humanity's resistance. But then he realized with a cold, sinking feeling that this wasn't them. It wasn't the invaders at all. The vibration was coming from beneath the earth itself, and it was building. He turned, quickly scanning the remains of the settlement. His eyes darted over the broken buildings, the scorched streets, the remnants of humanity's last stand. His team had been scattered across the area, trying to hold their ground, trying to survive. But now he wasn't sure what they were up against anymore. It had never been just the invaders. No, there had always been something more, a feeling he couldn't quite shake, something that had been gnawing at the back of his mind since the first day they arrived. They had landed on this planet with a simple mission, to stop the invaders. But in doing so, they had unknowingly triggered something far worse. The planet's mysteries were deeper than they had ever imagined, and as the days went on, as the resistance against the invaders grew fiercer, the secrets of this world began to unravel. The man's thoughts flickered back to the initial reports, the brief, almost dismissive scans they had received before landing. The planet had seemed uninhabited, its history buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten ruins. There had been little to suggest that it was anything but a barren rock, one of many in the endless void of space. But the initial readings had been wrong. So wrong. And now they were all paying the price. He shook his head, trying to focus. His team, what was left of them, would need him. They were depending on him. They had made it this far, surviving against overwhelming odds. But this was different. This was no longer just about fighting an enemy with superior technology. This was about something else entirely. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how little they really understood. The invaders weren't the only threat. The planet itself had a voice, and now it was speaking. He tightened his grip on his weapon and moved toward the heart of the settlement. He had to find his comrades. He had to make sure they were still alive, still fighting. The vibrations were growing stronger, louder now, almost deafening as they reverberated through the earth. He was almost there, just a few more steps and he would reach the main encampment. But as he rounded the corner, the sight before him stopped him dead in his tracks. The encampment was empty. No soldiers. No civilians. No sign of life. His stomach twisted as the realization hit him. They were gone. All of them. Gone without a trace. He stepped forward cautiously, scanning the area, but there was no movement, no sounds, nothing. The air felt thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the ground shook again, more violently this time, and the man stumbled, barely keeping his footing. He reached out, grabbing onto the nearest building for support. The world felt like it was coming apart around him, as if the entire planet was about to split open. And then a voice. A voice that wasn't his own. A voice that seemed to come from every direction at once, resonating deep within his bones. Asterisk, you are not the first. Asterisk. The man froze, the words reverberating through him, filling his mind with a cold dread. The voice wasn't a language he understood, but somehow he knew what it meant. The earth beneath his feet groaned, and a dark shadow shifted in the distance. He wasn't alone. And whatever this presence was, it wasn't just a force of nature. It was intelligent. It was alive. And it was waiting. The vibrations ceased, but the air was still charged with an energy that made it hard to think clearly. The man's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving. But as he turned to leave, he saw something in the distance. Movement just beyond the crumbled buildings. A figure. He couldn't make out the details, but he could tell it wasn't human. The silhouette was wrong, its proportions off in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. His breath caught in his throat as he took a step back. This wasn't a soldier. This wasn't an invader. It was something else entirely. Something new. His hand went to his weapon, his fingers trembling as he aimed it toward the figure. But just before he could fire, the figure spoke. Asterisk, do not fight. Asterisk. The voice was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It was deep, resonant, and yet strangely calm, as if the figure had no fear of the man, no reason to be afraid. Asterisk, you will not survive this world by fighting. You will not survive by running. You will only survive by understanding. Asterisk. The man's chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind raced, spinning with questions that he couldn't answer. What was this? Who was this being and why had it come? Was it friend or foe? But the figure didn't wait for him to ask. It stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer in the dim light of the ruined settlement. It was taller than any human, its skin smooth and dark, its features strangely formless. There was something almost alien about it, but not in the way he had come to expect. It wasn't a creature from another planet, it was something deeper, something that transcended the idea of a species. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, and it regarded the man with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then it raised a hand and gestured toward the broken city. Asterisk, this world is not what you think. Your fight is not with the invaders. It never was. Asterisk. And just as the man began to speak, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently than ever before. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time he saw something like pity. Asterisk, it is already too late. Asterisk. The ground split open and the man was thrown back, his world spinning as the earth itself erupted. And the last thing he heard, just before everything went dark, was a deep, rumbling sound, one that felt like the very heartbeat of the planet itself. The world had fallen silent once again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace. It was the kind that made every movement feel like an intrusion, every breath a challenge to the stillness that enveloped him. The man blinked, trying to clear the haze from his mind, but the darkness was thick. He couldn't tell if his eyes were still closed or if the night had come to swallow him whole. His body felt like it was made of lead, every inch of him heavy and strained, as though the ground beneath him was pulling him down. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth, and his head throbbed, a dull ache that pounded with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He pushed himself up, his fingers scraping against jagged stone as he tried to steady himself. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. The world was still shaking, the ground shifting beneath him, but he couldn't tell how far he had been thrown, how long he had been unconscious. The dust in the air made it hard to see and even harder to breathe. It was as if the planet itself was rejecting them, every step of the human's existence now an insult to something deeper, something that lived in the core of this place. His thoughts were disjointed, each one a frantic echo in his mind. The figure, the strange being that had spoken to him, its words lingering like a weight in his chest. It's already too late. Those words hadn't left him. He couldn't understand them. He couldn't accept them. How could they be too late? They were human survivors. They had fought for this planet, for their future. But now it felt like the fight itself was meaningless, like all their efforts had been futile. He staggered to his feet, each motion painful. His hand gripped the weapon that had once been an extension of his own arm, but now it felt alien, like it had no place in this fight. The energy from the Earth's tremor still thrummed in the air, vibrating through his bones, and he could hear something else now, something faint but unmistakable. A sound. It was a whisper at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the earth. No, it was something else. The whisper seemed to come from all directions, filling the space around him, suffocating him in its presence. He spun around, his senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle felt like a threat. But no matter where he looked, he saw nothing. And yet, the sound persisted, growing more distinct, more intentional. The whispering had turned into voices now, voices that seemed to speak in unison. "You are not the first." The phrase echoed in his mind over and over again, until it felt like it was becoming a part of him, burrowing into his very thoughts. His breath caught in his throat, and for the first time since he'd set foot on this planet, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even about the invaders. The stakes had shifted, this was something bigger. Whatever was happening, whatever force they had awakened, was not just trying to destroy them. It was trying to erase them. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but there was no way to trace their origin. No way to stop them. His mind was being overwhelmed with a flood of images, visions, memories that weren't his own. The desolate face of the planet, long before they had arrived. The ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen countless times before humanity had ever set foot on its surface. And in each image, there was a sense of inevitability, as though history was doomed to repeat itself forever, an endless cycle that humanity was destined to become a part of. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was even worse than before. It wasn't empty. It wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that threatened to crush him, to bury him under its weight. He stood there, trembling, knowing that something was coming, something that would change everything. His hands were shaking as he gripped the weapon tighter, the metal biting into his skin. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. He had to find his team. They were still out there, somewhere. But even as he took a step forward, the earth trembled again, a low growl that reverberated through his entire body. It was more than just the ground shaking. It was something beneath the surface, a force that wasn't just destructive but purposeful. And then he saw it. A crack, deep in the ground, spreading outward like a wound in the earth's skin. The very air around him seemed to hum with energy, and he could feel the temperature rise as the crack widened, revealing a deep, glowing fissure that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. The man's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what it was. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew with every fiber of his being that it wasn't good. This wasn't just some underground cavern or hidden resource. No, this was something much worse. This was the planet itself, opening its mouth, ready to consume everything in its path. And that's when he saw them. Shadows moving along the edges of the crack, figures that were more like shapes, more like ripples in the air itself. They were coming from the depths, rising slowly, steadily. The ground seemed to part before them, and the air around them shimmered with a strange, almost liquid quality. They were here. The man's breath caught in his throat. There were no words. No way to describe what he was seeing. They weren't invaders. They weren't creatures from another planet. They were something else entirely, something that had lived within the planet all along, waiting. Watching. They had always been here. He took a step back, heart pounding, but the ground shifted again, pulling him closer to the crack. He had no choice. He had to face them. One of the figures emerged fully from the fissure, and the man's knees buckled beneath him. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen. It was tall, taller than any human, and its form was almost fluid, like something between shadow and light. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and endless, drawing in all the light around it. It tilted its head slightly as though studying him. And then it spoke, its voice filling the air around him, reverberating in his very soul. You are not the first, but you will be the last. The words sent a chill through him, deeper than anything he had ever felt. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what it meant, to beg for answers. But no words came. His throat felt tight, his chest constricting as the figure took another step forward. And then the ground shook again, violently this time, as though the very planet was screaming. The sky above darkened, a shadow creeping over the horizon. The man's heart thundered in his chest, and every instinct told him to run, to flee before it was too late. But there was no escaping this. There was nowhere left to hide. And as the first tendrils of darkness reached out to claim him, he knew deep down that the battle wasn't just for their survival anymore. It was for the very soul of humanity. The darkness seemed to stretch, pulling tighter around him as the figure moved closer. Its form shimmering and changing with each passing moment. The air hummed with a low, vibrating frequency, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise as the ground beneath him trembled once again. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, but his feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. He could hear it now, a faint sound like the whisper of wind through the trees, but it was different this time. It wasn't a whisper at all. It was a voice, familiar and distant at the same time, echoing in his mind like an ancient memory, one he couldn't quite place. You were never meant to survive. The words wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, and his chest tightened. The figure before him hadn't spoken them. No, this voice came from somewhere else. Something deeper, something that pulsed from the very core of the planet. It was the voice of something far older than anything humanity had ever encountered. He took a shaky step back, his mind racing. Survive. What did that mean? He was a human, a survivor. He had fought through every battle, every loss. There was nothing he wouldn't endure to protect what was left of humanity. But this was different. This wasn't just survival. It was something much larger, something he couldn't even comprehend. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted. A new sound pierced through the tension, a sound that sent a shock of realization straight to his bones. It was a noise he had never expected to hear in this place, human voices. At first, he thought it was a trick, his mind playing games with him under the pressure. But no, it wasn't in his head. The voices were real. They were coming from behind him, from the darkness, growing louder and closer by the second. He turned, his heart racing, and there, emerging from the shadows, were figures he recognized, members of his team. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes torn and bloodied, but it was them. They were alive. But something was wrong. The way they moved wasn't right. They walked with an odd, mechanical precision, their eyes vacant, as if their minds had been stripped away. Their expressions were blank, void of any emotion. It was as though they were puppets, strings pulled by an unseen hand. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the horror of what he was witnessing. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What happened to you? The first of them, a man he had once fought beside, turned his head slowly toward him. His eyes were empty, dark, like the figure that stood before him. And then, in a voice that was no longer his, he spoke. We were chosen. Just like you will be. The word sent a cold shiver down his spine. Chosen? Chosen for what? To become like them? To be turned into, whatever these things were. His stomach twisted in horror, but before he could ask another question, the ground beneath him quaked once again, stronger this time. A deep rumble, followed by a violent shockwave that sent him crashing to the ground. He barely had time to react before something else emerged from the fissure, something far larger than the shadowy figures that had already appeared. A shape, monstrous in size, began to rise from the depths of the earth, its silhouette cutting through the darkness like a looming giant. It was massive, towering over everything, its presence suffocating the air around them. Every step it took sent shockwaves through the ground, and the very sky above seemed to tremble at its approach. It was no longer just a matter of survival. It was something more. The planet itself was waking up, reacting to the invasion of humanity, and it was angry. The figure before him, the one that had spoken of doom, stepped aside, allowing the giant to rise fully, its form taking shape. It was a creature beyond any human understanding, its body a strange mix of molten rock and pulsating energy. The very sight of it made the air grow hot, and he could feel the sweat on his brow evaporate instantly. It stood there for a moment, towering over the ruined landscape, its eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. It scanned the man and his team, its gaze sharp and calculating, as though it were assessing them like insects beneath a magnifying glass. And then, in a voice that reverberated in the very core of his chest, the giant spoke. Asterisk, the time has come. You will either join us, or you will perish with the others. Asterisk. The man's heart hammered in his chest, his mind spinning with questions. Join them? What did that even mean? How could they possibly perish with the others? Behind him, his team stood still, their movements synchronized with terrifying precision. They had been here before just like him. They had fought for survival, had clawed their way through the same battles. Yet here they were, mere shells of the people they had once been, standing in the shadow of this creature, these invaders, their fate seemingly sealed. And then another voice joined the fray. It was weak at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer as it cut through the tension. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk. The man spun toward the voice, his eyes searching the darkness. He saw another figure standing just at the edge of the fading light, a woman, her features faint but familiar. She was alone, and she was looking directly at him. Her eyes held a message. A warning. She knew something. She knew what was happening, and she was the key to understanding it all. But before he could move toward her, the creature raised one massive arm, sending a pulse of energy surging through the air. The force of it knocked him off his feet once again, and as he tried to regain his balance, the ground beneath him split open, sending him sliding toward the edge of the chasm. The figure of the woman vanished into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared, leaving him with only the ominous words of the creature to cling to. Asterisk, your choice is clear. You have no future without us. Asterisk. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and yet, as he struggled to regain his footing, he knew that the fight was far from over. The darkness was closing in, the lines between friend and foe blurring with every passing second. The question that haunted him now wasn't about survival, it was about what humanity was willing to become in the face of something so vast, so incomprehensible. Would they fight back? Or would they be consumed by the very forces they had unwittingly awakened? The tension mounted with each passing moment. The weight of the choice pressed down on him, suffocating him with its finality. And still the battle raged within him. The ground beneath him cracked again, the rift widening as the massive creature above him loomed ever closer. The pulse of energy had left him disoriented, but there was no time to lose. The air was growing hotter, the very atmosphere bending under the weight of the entity's presence. His heart hammered in his chest, but there was no fear left. Only clarity. He had no choice but to fight. His hands gripped the edge of the chasm, pulling himself up with what little strength remained. His team, once proud and full of life, were now reduced to hollow shells of their former selves, moving with mechanical precision. His mind raced, desperate for a way to reach them, to snap them out of whatever trance had taken hold. But it felt futile. They were lost. He could hear the low hum of energy building as the creature raised its hand again, preparing to deliver another crushing blow. There was no way he could escape this time. No running. No hiding. Fight! The voice inside him urged, the one that had kept him alive through every impossible situation. He had faced the unknown before, had survived when it seemed like all hope was lost. This is just another battle. With a grunt, he pulled himself from the edge, steadying his feet on the cracked earth. The woman, the one who had warned him, was still somewhere in the shadows, but he couldn't wait for her. His eyes locked on the giant. It was now or never. He reached for the weapon strapped to his back, an experimental piece of technology that had been deemed useless by everyone else. They had thought it was too unstable, too unpredictable. But he had a different feeling about it. In his gut, he knew it was his only chance. As he moved toward the creature, the world seemed to slow. The distance between them felt like an eternity, the weight of his decision heavy in every step he took. But the closer he got, the clearer it became. This was no alien, no invader from another world. This was something far more ancient. A force that had lived beneath the surface of humanity's understanding for eons. And yet, it had underestimated humans. He activated the weapon. A crackling energy shot out, illuminating the darkness with a blinding blue light. The giant recoiled, its form flickering, destabilizing as the energy surged around it. The ground trembled as if the planet itself were reacting to the disturbance, but the creature did not fall. Instead, it turned its head, its glowing eyes locking onto him. For a moment there was silence, a deadly, still silence that stretched on, and then it spoke again. Asterisk, You think you can defeat me? Asterisk, the voice was deep, mocking, vibrating in the air around them. Asterisk, you are nothing. Just a fleeting moment in time. Asterisk, the words were meant to break him, to remind him of his insignificance. But they didn't. Not this time. The weapon continued to pulse with power, and he took a step forward. We are nothing, he said, his voice steady despite the fear still clawing at the edges of his mind. But you are something far worse. You're a dying species trying to drag us into the abyss with you. The creature's form flickered again, its monstrous body shimmering as if it were struggling to hold itself together. The cracks in its surface deepened, revealing an eerie, glowing light beneath. It was weakening. The weapon was working. But the creature was not finished yet. With a sudden, violent roar, it lunged toward him. The ground beneath them exploded, sending debris flying in all directions. He barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side just as the creature's massive clawed hands slammed into the earth where he had stood seconds before. The shockwave sent him flying, his body crashing into a jagged rock. Pain lanced through him, but he fought it down, forced himself back to his feet. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. He aimed the weapon again, his hands shaking as he adjusted the power levels, knowing this would be the final shot. The creature was on the move again, its towering figure blocking out the sky, its claws reaching for him. But as he pulled the trigger, something unexpected happened. The weapon didn't fire as he expected. Instead, it unleashed a torrent of energy, too much energy, cascading out of control. The crackling force enveloped him, lifting him off the ground. For a moment, everything went white and then the world went dark. His body felt weightless, suspended in the void. He wasn't sure how long it had been before he came to. The air was still thick with smoke and dust and he could feel the heat on his skin. The battle had stopped, but he didn't know what had happened, didn't know if the creature had been defeated or if he had failed. Slowly he opened his eyes and when he did, the sight before him made his heart stop. The creature was gone. Not defeated. Just gone. There was no trace of it, no remnants of its massive body or glowing eyes. The earth had returned to its normal, quiet state, as if the battle had never happened. But the silence felt wrong. The tension in the air, the uncertainty, was overwhelming. His gaze shifted to his team. They were standing still, their eyes now wide and searching, as if they were seeing the world for the first time. They looked at him as though they had just awakened from a long sleep. But there was something else in their eyes. Something different. Something that hadn't been there before. And then he saw her, the woman who had warned him. She stood at the edge of the crater, watching him with a look of understanding. She hadn't been affected by the energy pulse. She had known what was going to happen. The realization hit him hard. She was one of them. Not human. Not a survivor. She was something else entirely, something he couldn't comprehend. Before he could say anything, the woman turned and began to walk away. Her figure slowly fading into the shadows, disappearing like a ghost. And as she vanished from sight, the final twist of the story unfolded. A voice, a soft, whispering hum, filled the silence. It was her voice, but it wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. For humanity. Asterisk, this was never about defeating them. Asterisk. His heart skipped a beat as the true meaning of her words settled in. This was never about survival, it was about evolution. About what humanity was capable of when pushed to its limits. The weapon hadn't destroyed the creature. It had unlocked something else, something that no one could yet understand. He glanced at his team, their faces still filled with confusion and wonder, and he realized that the battle wasn't over. Not for him. Not for them. The true war was just beginning. And humanity, for the first time in history, was standing on the precipice of something far greater than survival. They had been chosen too. And now the real story was about to unfold. The dust had barely begun to settle when the team slowly gathered around him. Their faces, still marked with confusion and a touch of fear, reflected the magnitude of what had just transpired. The echoes of the battle reverberated in their minds, but there was a deeper understanding in the silence now. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. The earth, once cracked and shattered, now seemed to breathe again, as if the planet itself had been waiting for this to happen. For a second everything was still, too still. Then one by one his team began to speak, their voices shaking with disbelief but also tinged with something else, something new. The woman, the mysterious figure who had been his guide in the darkest moments, had left them with more than just the weapon. She had left them with a question that was impossible to ignore. "Do you think we were meant to win?" one of his team members asked, his voice low, almost afraid to give voice to the thought that had been growing in their minds. The man who had been the first to fall to the creature, the one who had been close to losing himself in the depths of fear, now looked up with newfound resolve. "No," he said, his eyes intense. "We weren't supposed to just survive. We were meant to change." The weight of that realization hit him all at once. They weren't simply a group of survivors. They weren't just humanity's last stand. What had happened, what they had awakened, was the beginning of something far bigger. Something that would change the course of human history forever. "What do we do now?" another voice asked, softer than the rest. It was the woman who had been closest to the weapon. She was staring at the ground, deep in thought, as if she could still feel the pulse of energy coursing through her. "The world, the universe, it's different now." He nodded, glancing back at the horizon where the earth seemed to shimmer with a quiet kind of energy. The change was unmistakable. The world felt alive in ways he had never felt before, and it wasn't just the terrain that had shifted. Humanity itself had undergone a transformation. They had crossed a line that had been drawn centuries ago, and now there was no going back. "What happens to us now?" the same woman asked again, her voice trembled but stronger this time. He thought about it for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The answer was clearer than he had imagined. "We embrace it," he said, his voice steady. "We are not the same anymore. We've seen the truth of what humanity is capable of. We've been given a glimpse of what we can become. The real battle isn't with them." He paused, looking over his shoulder, as if expecting the creature to reappear from the shadows. "The real battle is with ourselves. The choices we make now will define everything." One of the others, the quietest among them, stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "What if we don't know what to do with this power? What if we're not ready for it?" "That's the point," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We don't need to be ready. We just need to keep moving forward. Together. And if we fall, we'll fall together." He met each of their gazes one by one. "But we have something none of them had, the will to adapt. The will to change. We are humanity. And that, in the end, will always be enough." The silence that followed was different from before. There was a quiet understanding now, a shared bond forged in the heat of battle. They had faced something beyond their comprehension, something that had the power to end them, and yet, here they were. Alive. United. And then the realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't the end of their story. This was only the beginning. Humanity had always been at its strongest when it was pushed to its limits. When survival depended on innovation, on daring to do the impossible. And now they had reached a new threshold. The world around them was changing, and so were they. The power they had unlocked wasn't just about defeating monsters or surviving wars. It was about evolution, about the potential for humanity to transcend the boundaries of what it had once thought possible. He turned his gaze to the horizon once more, where the earth and sky met in a perfect, infinite line. The future was unknown, full of uncertainty. But one thing was clear: humanity had never been more powerful. Never more capable of greatness. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. There would be those who would fear this change, those who would resist. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of their power would feel unbearable. But through it all, he knew one thing for certain. Humanity was destined for greatness. They had been given a gift, a chance to reshape the world, to build something new from the ashes of the old. They had not only survived, they had evolved. And now they would lead the way. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he understood his place in the grand tapestry of the universe. They were no longer just survivors, they were the future. The dawn of a new era. And with that, they moved forward together, their hearts filled with hope, their minds focused on the possibilities ahead. The world had changed, and so had they. And there was no going back.